Parshas Vayeitzei, Tavshin Pei Aleph, and now we're into year number 12 of our shir, and we continue along with a bit of the theme that we've been speaking about the past couple of weeks, and really throughout these parshias of the Torah. The underlying theme is really one of teaching us the ways of the Avos. The Torah teaches us about the lives of the Avos, how they conducted themselves, and really the way they conducted themselves in Avodas Hashem, because that's what's most important for us to learn. How did the Avos go about serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu? And the Nesivos Shalom calls the Avos, he calls them the Yesod of the Torah. That when we read these parshios about the Avos, we're getting the foundation, we're getting the Yesod of the entire Torah. And because the Avos, we know, were the beginning of the Olam HaTikun. The generations before the Avos were not that good, and the Avos began the Olam HaTikun. And for those who are a little bit into Kabbalah, and I know that everybody here is into Kabbalah, it's hard to avoid. Nesivos Shalom in many different places there's a lot of Kabbalah tucked away in here. So, we try to dance around and do all the ones that maybe don't cover so much Kabbalah. But eventually, if we want to say a different shir, we have to touch on some Kabbalah. And he says like this: we know that there were actually 10 nations living in Eretz Canaan. There were 10 nations there. Before Klal Yisrael got Eretz Yisrael, there were 10 nations living in Eretz Canaan. But we all know that Klal Yisrael was only Yoresh 7, the Zion Amamin. Klal Yisrael, when they came to Eretz Yisrael, they were only Yoresh 7 of those nations. And the Avos and the rest of the Shivas Haroyim, the rest of the Shiva Royim, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Moshe, Aaron, Yosef, right, all the 7 Royim, they were each misakein one of the 7 midos, and when they were misakein one of those 7 midos, in that zechus, Klal Yisrael was zeicha to be Yerush, one of the nations. There were Shiva Royim from Avraham down, right? There were Shiva Royim, and each one got a zechus that we were able through them to be Yerush, to defeat one of the nations of Eretz Canaan. But then there's 3 more. So Nesivos Shalom tells us that the last 3 of the Spheros, the last 3 that are left, which is Chachma, Bina, and Das, those 3 things, the Chachma, Bina, and Das, which is acronym Chabad, which in case somebody wants to know how they ever got their name, Chachma, Bina, and Das is Chabad. Those 3, the last 3 of the Spheros, them we will only inherit with the Yemais HaMashiach. And that's your little bit of Kabbalah today. And these parshios, before Kabbalah HaTorah, the Torah is telling us how the Avos, what kind of a schus, we're saying that each of the Avos had a schus, and through their schus we were able to inherit one of the nations that were occupying. Now we see who was really the occupying forces in Eretz Yisrael and who it really belongs to. But in the schus of them, we were able to take over one of those nations, and each of the Avos did something special. By Avraham Avinu, we know it's how Avraham Avinu accepted everything that Hashem sent his way, ba'ava. The midah of Avraham Avinu was ava. But the lesson we need to learn in our parsha of this week's, the lesson we learn from Yaakov Avinu, what was the driving force of Yaakov Avinu? In what chus did we take out of Yaakov Avinu? Yaakov Avinu was a bit different. Because our parsha and the other parshias also that speak about Yaakov Avinu, they tell us how Yaakov Avinu conducted himself not on some high level, spiritual. Yaakov Avinu, the Torah tells us how Yaakov conducted himself in Olam Hazeh. Read the Parshiyos. What do we talk about Yaakov Avinu? Yaakov Avinu taught us how to build a house, how to have and raise a family, to raise children, how to do business, even when you have to do business and deal with someone like Lavan, right? Yaakov Avinu, he went and he worked for somebody, he worked for a boss that wasn't too honest, that wasn't too good. Yaakov Avinu showed us how does a person conduct themselves when it comes to the Olam Hazeh, when it comes to getting married, when it comes to raising a family, when it comes to going to work, and even working for someone that is dishonest. That's what we learn from Yaakov Avinu. And what Yaakov Avinu showed us is that in every one of these aspects, in every one of these things, it can be done with Kedusha. That's the way to do it, the way to go about it. As we say, we say, Kedoshenu, Kedosh Yaakov. Our holiness, it comes from what? Kedosh Yaakov. Yaakov Avinu showed us, of course the other Avos showed us lofty and high things, but Yaakov Avinu showed us that every one of us is capable. Yaakov Avinu showed us, that's the schus that Yaakov Avinu had, and that's the schus through which Yaakov Avinu, we were Yerush, a nation that was occupying Eretz Canaan. Yaakov Avinu showed us that how your regular daily activities become Torah. We see the Torah speaks extensively about Yaakov Avinu and what he did and how he raised his family and how he ran his life and how he went to work, how the Torah, Yaakov Avinu's everyday activities became Torah, and a big yesod of the Torah, says in Nesivos Shalom. It becomes Torah and it becomes Kedusha. And the Torah is teaching us, and it tells us that a Jew just going about daily life, going about your daily life, doing the regular things that regular people do, you can bring up the level so high that it becomes a chelek of the Torah. It becomes a chelek of a large part of the Torah. And the Torah actually consists of three types of inyanim. If you want to know what's in the Torah, what kind of commandments we have in the Torah, let's break it up into three different things. One part of the Torah is mitzvahs aseh. It tells us what we have to do, which mitzvahs we have to do. Then the second part of the Torah is mitzvahs lo aseh. The Torah tells us what not to do. And then there's a third part. The third part is inyane rishus. Inyane rishus means things that you actually do every day. How to go about doing that. The Avos taught us each one of these three different parts of the Torah. Avraham Avinu, we know, was midas hachesed, midas hahava, and the root, and that is the root of the way every person, when you do mitzvahs, when you do a mitzvah, you're supposed to do it with ahava. You're supposed to do it by loving HaKadosh Baruch Hu, by loving to do mitzvahs. That's what we learned from Avraham Avinu. That's mitzvahs aseh. The mitzvahs aseh, the way to do it, with ava, with love for Hashem, that we learned from Avraham Avinu. Yitzchak Avinu was different. Yitzchak Avinu was midas hagvura and yira, and we know midas hagvura and yira represent the mitzvahs lo aseh, where you have yiras Hashem. But Yaakov Avinu teaches us what we spoke about before. Yaakov Avinu teaches us the third chelek of the Torah. He teaches us the other part of life, the inyane rishus, how to go about our regular daily activities. That an entire Torah, an entire chelek of the Torah is created just from the way that you conduct the regular things in your life. Like Yaakov Avinu, Nesivos Shalom said, Yaakov Avinu was mesakein tfilas arvis. Yaakov Avinu, right? We said the Shachris by Avraham Avinu. Yitzchak was mesakein mincha, and Yaakov Avinu tfilas arvis. We know tfilas arvis is a tfilas rishus. It's a rishus. It's not an obligation as much. Today, I'm not getting into the halachic ramifications, but we know it's not as much of a commandment as Tfilas Shachris, Tfilas Mincha. It's a Tfilas Rishus, and that fits in well. Yaakov Avinu taught us about things that are Rishus. Grab on to something that's a Rishus. Grab on and do it. So the pasuk in our parsha tells us, Vayisa Yaakov es bonav es noshav. When Yaakov Avinu wanted to travel, he lifted up. The Torah doesn't say he traveled. The Torah tells us that he lifted. Vayisa Yaakov es bonav es noshav. That Yaakov Avinu lifted up. And what did he do? He lifted up and raised the level of his children and of his wives. Each activity of Yaakov became a chelek HaTorah. The way Yaakov was making all his daily actions and interactions into things full of kedusha. With that, Vayisa Yaakov es bonav es noshav. That's how you raise up the level of your family. And the dream that Yaakov had in the parsha, the dream that Yaakov was laying on the ground and there was a ladder that went all the way up to Shamayim, that represents what every one of us needs to learn from Yaakov Avinu. Where there's a sulam mutzav arza. Every person can't act. You can't just act like you're somewhere up in the clouds. We have to know that you live here on this earth. And Rabbeinu Shalom put you on this earth because he wants you to be on this earth. You're not supposed to act like you're flying somewhere around the clouds. You're holier than thou. That you have no shaykhs to Olam Hazeh. You're here. You're an Olam Hazeh. You're a sulam mutzav arza. Your feet are firmly planted on the earth. And if they're not on earth, and if you feel like you're not on earth, you have other problems. But you are supposed to be planted on the earth. But you have to remember the end. V'roishoi magia hashamayma. Yaakov Avinu represented, it's possible and you should be a sulam mutzav arza. Be a normal person. Be a person that understands you have a job in Olam Hazeh. That's why you're here. But v'roishoi magia hashamayma. That it's dafka, the earthly things, the things that are mutzav arza, that they should be raised up. How do you conduct yourself at home? How do you go to work? How do you get up in the morning? What do you do with your day? That is what actually makes a person. Nesivos Shalom tells us, we say in the davening, Mol'ah ha'aretz kinyonecha. So normally, the translation means the world is full of your creations, but says in Nesivos Shalom, Mol'ah ha'aretz kinyonecha, the world is full of ways to be koina Hashem. By every action that you do during the day, from the time you wake up to the time you go to sleep, Mal'ah ha'aretz kinyonecha. One thing after the other, you could be koina HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that is what Hashem wants. Hashem wants that we should act differently and better than other nations of the world in our daily activities. To do as Yaakov Avinu did. To marry in a better way, to have and bring up your children in a better way. That's what the Torah goes through. Yaakov Avinu got married. He had different wives. He had Shvatim. Yaakov Avinu, how he went about his day. He negotiated with Lavan. Everything with an honesty, with a purity. Yaakov Avinu brought up his children and his family, and he conducted his business activities honestly. Even when you run into a Lavan, even when you run into somebody who's dishonest, Yaakov Avinu even showed us that. How to behave, how to go about, to never lose sight of who we are and the standards we have to live up to. And that is Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov Avinu teaches us tfilas, rishus. Yaakov Avinu teaches us the chelek of the Torah about how to conduct your lives with things that are optional, with things that regular people do. And that is the life of Yaakov Avinu. And that is really what we could learn from this week's Parsha. We learn our daily activities. We learn from Yaakov Avinu how we are supposed to conduct ourselves each and every day.